This is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Nežo Zupanc, and today's guest is Alastair White. Alastair, welcome, and please a couple of words of introduction.
Hi Nežo, lovely to see you, and thank you so much for having me today. Great to be here. Now, I'm a composer based in Scotland. I've worked in primarily in opera recently, but also I've collaborated with the ensemble on a number of series of kind of chamber works over the last few years, including a series on negativity, and more recently one on the idea of a field of vision and how that the act of looking can reduce space to two-dimensional pain that permits a different type of movement and development through it. So that was the most recent thing last year. And yeah, so thank you so much for speaking to me today. Very excited to...
All right, so before we jump into the current, what you're currently working on, which we will, I'm interested in how did you get to music?
Okay, so I suppose I didn't start life in the classical music world. I was a keyboard player in a band for many years. That was, and I was unable to read or write music. I did it all through, I suppose, what you would call now feel, which is it's a strange thing, but I guess you still do that as a composer. You're always just groping around in the dark, beyond the edge of what you're able to conceptualize. And that's usually where the most interesting stuff happens, whether it's, trying to feel out chord progressions or on a piano or trying to, even using a notational device to get something. You're always trying to work at the edges of your perception. So yeah, I suppose I was just groping around in the dark, and I still am. I did that for, I suppose, 10 years. It was a mix of there was, two bands really. One was more in which I worked in a more production role, and the other one was piano, and eventually got into more doing things like arrangement. Worked on a film and did a soundtrack for that movie, and that really made me start to think saw the things that composition was able to achieve. It was a much broader canvas. And whether you were still, ultimately blind and feeling around, you were maybe you had more hands. Let's say that could be the way of conceptualizing. And so really.
Can I ask at this point something that I usually notice, like knowing how to compose, just that phrase, linguistic phrase. You did that as one of your first compositional, in a sense, as we usually talk about it, actions. If I understand you correct, you basically played in bands, and then at some point you composed a soundtrack for a film.
So yeah, I suppose that's the thing about composition, isn't it? At what point are you the move from a single line into a broader canvas, and there was no real break between that, but it was perhaps working with that larger sense of creating a soundtrack. And it was around about the same time that I discovered classical music. So I discovered it was really, in particular, opera and The Ring. And it was just so, I was always really into concept albums, really into maybe the way that music could tell stories, and discovering, what's essentially, to me then, a 16-hour concept album.
Right.
That is, in which narrative is dealt with musically at the most basic level, with this idea of motif that could be almost like a semantic unit, like a word that takes on, is then woven into a narrative, was to me absolutely mind-blowing, and made me really want to learn the tools of how to do that. Yeah.
Right.
And so I went back, and I suppose at first kind of just taught myself to a certain level before going back to study my master's. And that would have been about 2016. And so came over to the dark side, to the dark side of classical music, and I've not looked back.
Right. So fast forward, since I have quite a reference of since we work together quite extensively in the framework of the abeceda ensemble now for years, at this point, what would you say? How would you, let's say in simple or in short, describe or present your compositional practice? Compositional practice is the main subject of this conversation. What would you say everything is a part of that practice? From what I learned as a performer of your compositions is that there's a big role that philosophy plays there. So I'm interested about that. And what else do you see as constituting your practice of composition?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I suppose there's no way about talking about how philosophy functions in my work without sounding like a total idiot, without sounding very, very pretentious. But I suppose we're doing classical composition. Let's just go the whole hog. When I began, I thought one of the reasons for learning to do this was to try and construct, trying to do something that was original and had meaning, which I felt that the tools that I had in my previous life I wasn't capable of doing. So when I wanted to learn composition, it wasn't just to compose a sonata. It was to try to rethink what I was doing with music completely. And to me, that meant building a metaphysical model that was my own, and to understand where composition figured within that. And so which sounds, the word is highfalutin, right? But then that was the only way that I could conceive of building an original compositional practice. You start out, what is the world? And then you build up from there to what is composition within that, which is really what I ended up with, is really just a type of transcendental materialism, in which art is is something that can mediate the subject's relationship to that world and construct a new form of subjectivity. Without going too much into detail, my work, the original idea was to seek to conceive some kind of Optimus Prime style subject in which technology or a text or an artwork, all of these things are the same, could function as a way of combining alienated individuals together to create what I call a contingent subjectivity, like a subjectivity that reaches beyond the limits of the real, whether that's the social reality or even possibly biological reality, to create new perceptions. So especially my work in opera, it's the idea that it's not the individual that perceives something. As an individual, you are only ever perceiving a limited part of the whole, and the work is experienced by the contingent subject, which is the composite of the artwork and all the individuals participating, whether they be musicians or audience members. How that functions technically in lots of different ways, essentially through my personal idea of what relation is, which is a material theory of relation, in which relationship can be created between two objects that surpasses the original objects and nevertheless has a material foundation within them. So, to give an example of this, how it works technically could be that quite often my compositional writing builds in mutually exclusive objects within it, and so that two equally contradictory perspectives are possible, so someone may say this is X and somebody say this is Y, and however not at a level of interpretation, for instance, this means this, or this means X, or this means Y, but rather this is like at an ontological level. For instance, this is the same note. One piece of research I did, I give an example of two different reviews, which were both very bad reviews, actually, pannings, you might say, kickings, where they both say they agree on one thing, which is this is the worst piece ever written. They disagree, so that hermeneutically their interpretation is the same, but their description of the ontology of the work is very different. One says this is just the same notes, the same few notes repeated over and over, and the other one says there's not a single note that has any repetition or any connection to any other note in the piece, and that is built within the work. That is it's basically a very good description of my compositional style of trying to balance total plurality with total immanence, and that as a listening individual within that, your whole context is only going to allow what's essentially a superposition, like, to collapse into this or into that. But together, the two of you perceiving this remake that superposition, remake that relation between you, which is within the work, and together you become a subject that is, so it's together, though you may not ever know it. These two critics who hated the work so much, that is a contingent subject right there between them and the work perceiving it. And it means that in some way, this, not either one of them, but the subject itself has transcended the limits of our given alienated individuality, because we're participating in something more than that. And obviously I don't achieve the... Sorry, go on.
Could one simple example of that be that composition for solo flute, The Snake That Eats the World, where there are 3 lines written at the same time? So the interpretation is always, it's impossible.
Absolutely. And this, I'm really, and maybe it'd be great to hear about your thoughts of that, actually. But just, this is what I suppose what I was talking about there is one form of relation, which is between plurality and immanence, which usually applies to questions of material and form. The snake of the world deals. For some reason, I never pronounce that correctly. I always say the snake that wheats the world.
Wheat. With the wheat, right?
World. Yeah, exactly. It's built on that same idea of plurality and immanence, of impossibility and singularity, so that the work is a kind of also multiplicity that collapses in your interpretation. But this also has to do with one of the other forms of relation in my work, which I which deals with the relationship between structure in a work and contingency. So that's it. The best way of explaining that is that a work, if you think of works of great plurality, such as, for instance, the work of Ferniho, which is, to my mind, is like one of those great, works of world music that has managed to sustain true plurality within it. There are, listening to it and performing it, there's so many avenues you can take through that it becomes almost inexhaustible.
Yeah.
However, that plurality is maintained through a keen sense of structure, of finality, and that the work has a horizon or a limit, or in one particular form of terminology might be called a master signifier, right, or a quilting point that says there is a limit to the work, and that through that limit it sustains a type of infinity. Okay, but what I'm trying to look for is, as I said with the previous relation, something beyond that limit, something that is true absolute plurality without, and the problem is that if you lose that limit in Ferniho, you end up just collapsing back into the one, which is what really is the problem with Deleuze and a lot of work based on Deleuze, is that you just get, instead of plurality, you actually just get oneness, in the sense, the best way of describing it is a heap of clothes, right? A heap of clothes doesn't look like a lot of different clothes. It just looks like a heap, right? A heap, like a pile. Yeah, let's say.
A heap of clothes. Yeah.
Bad example, but it just looks like a mess, right? It becomes one thing rather than many things.
Right. Okay, yeah.
It's a very bad way of explaining it, but it's a way of conceptualizing it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So without that limit, you can't really sustain that structure. Like, it's the same way that a city works. A city maintains, innumerable lives, but is done through some form of political or even physical limit or structure around the edge. So yeah, the way that my answer to that was this was a similar relation to polarity and immanence, but through the idea of contingency and structure. In that, when you compose a work, you create an absolute, complete structure that, like a city, with great attention to detail, no. Everything is justified, etc., 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 and then your final gesture in the work is to desecrate that structure with the option for the musician to change anything they want, in the sense that it is both a totally closed score and a totally open score at once. And again, maybe that's similar to what I was talking about with the two critics' perspectives, and the two types of the two ways of being that the work is. Similarly, at this level of being in interpretation and structure, it is also a contradiction, a contingent dialectic that permits, again, us to hopefully move beyond limitation. And so, working from that, the snake that eats the world was an idea, grew out of that. In that, could you do that not just at the rather banal level of you may change anything, because that's, of course, even though sometimes we talk about this in classical music and people say, we've never heard of this before, but of course it's very common in, if Ed Sheeran covers, Bruce Springsteen, nobody says, oh my God, the ontology of the work, what is it? People understand that it's Born to Run, played by Ed Sheeran, right? So it was like, could we actually work at a slightly less banal level than that? And what if the structure of the work is such that really actually what it requires you to do is to grow six arms and three mouths and three heads to play the work, to play the three things, because anything is always possible, right? The world is purely contingent. It's that could happen, that we could roll the dice and we could get a 7 instead of a 1 to a 6. So what's to say that isn't possible? And if failing that, something else maybe equally interesting happens. If without the growing of the arms, perhaps something even more fascinating can happen. And the collapse. So to answer your question, yes, it is. It's dealing with those ideas again of superpositional collapse, three things that have to become red, but also that idea of a work's totality and its total desecration. To have the idea in which you can maintain the structure, in which plurality can arise, but also to not have that master signifier, that quilting point that imposes a limit, if that makes sense.
So if you were now to speak to how you imagine the process of composition evolving after it goes into the domain of performance, with this background as you are now addressing it, how do you see someone's listening of your composition? Is it, in ideal case, informed by this, what you just spoke of, or not, or how do you see the possibilities of that and the reception? And with that, as you said, interpretation there's just one interpretation. Is that did I understand you correct?
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's
maybe we can you can shed more light to that part of what you said now, which is very extensive. Maybe you can shed more light to that via this, presenting how you see that reception part.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. And there is no, one way of thinking about this, and to make it a little bit more simple, particularly with the idea of perspective, is to think of it as a dialectic between the older modernist idea of the object, the artistic object, as having some kind of objective immanence within it that is a force for utopian good, and the more recent postmodernist idea of there being a series of, rather than it being a work, a text, which emerges from its encounter with a reader, and a way of essentially, like perhaps in the simplest way possible, that those two contradictory things can both exist, so that the work has a immanent structure within it that permits actually those infinitely plural readings to be contained. So something that is, yes, it is singular, and I suppose the word has a sense of aesthetic immanence and structure about it, but nevertheless permits true infinity. So permits there is no ideal encounter. There are just encounters. And I suppose, there is. The ideal encounter, take that back, is the final composite of all the encounters. And that's only where the work exists. So for instance, again, let's go back to the two critics. One critic says, this piece is non-causal. The other one says, this is causally repetitive. Both of those statements are what's the word be? Contradictorily? Contingently dialectically true. In that is the ideal encounter. Now, whether or not we are aware of that is something we can just reflect on ourselves. I feel like I've certainly experienced that, and in the opera house, in a performance of a really, one of those really wonderful transcendent evenings where you just feel it's not just the artwork, it is that you are combined within the through the text into this almost many-eyed angel, with you and the rest of the audience somehow becoming something more than human. And it's not dependent even upon the fact of its, even the physicality of the way the opera works. You have it also with, reading a novel is one of the great joys of reading very, by someone long dead, is communing with the dead and all the other dead who have read it. And there is, even though it's not part of the phenomenal experience of it, and I don't think we even notice it sometimes. It is what the experience is, ultimately. That sense
I just lost the signal for a second. Did you mention Speaker of the Dead or something else right now?
Oh no, so yeah, just that to commune, the sense of communing with the dead, which is again, that's another work we could talk about. But yeah. The old famous Stephen Greenblatt quote, isn't it? I began with the desire to speak with the dead, and today, but I think today, in our increasingly alienated, cut-off, lonely world, it's I began with the desire to speak to anybody at all, living or dead. So yeah, does that explain it a bit better? That was in terms of what is the ideal encounter? Ideal encounter.
Yes, it offers another angle to that. I won't say everything's clear for me. It's also a complex.
It is, and I apologize.
It's a complex case. So, but anyway, we continue with also. First of all, now when we were just there, you are also a writer. And if I may say, I thought it was brilliant what you wrote as a part of a score, right?
We're talking about composition 1.
Yeah, exactly. How does that? And also, I had a thought, which was this plurality. That, if I understand you correct, you are doing everything in order to assure that plurality still, first of all, being possible and remaining as a part of your composition. Also your practice as a writer and as a composer with. Who writes fashion opera, is that also just another example of where you bring that plurality into being your own practice on the macro level? If you take a look how many completely different things are happening, or a metaverse opera. Can you speak to that, and also perhaps just tell us more about how you get there? Is it connected to what you said? And we start with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think hope this may also make it a little clearer. And the reason, one of the many reasons it's called fashion opera and not something like ridiculous like contingent dialectics opera, which would be very very off-putting. Like it's because I mean, among other things, it's a very good way of explaining how it works. Let's just start with what you said about the disciplines. In that I feel like the practice itself is surprisingly anti-interdisciplinarity in the contemporary usage of the word. In that, I suppose what I feel, and I think a lot of people share this, is that art forms are being particularly more abstract arts like music constantly being asked to justify themselves by appeals to strategies out with themselves. For instance, though politics to me is an absolutely constituent part, like an absolutely integral part of what music is, but quite often music is asked to justify itself purely through politics in the absence of its own content, for instance. This happens often in works that might bill themselves as being interdisciplinary. So that you can I've forgotten the word, but you can give up on a part of what you're doing and delegate it. That's it. I wanted to say advocate, but that's not it. It's you can delegate to something else in the absence of something within what you're doing. Again, fashion opera, it comes back to this idea of two things being able to be true at once. The central idea is that fashion opera is something that is impossible. Fashion will always collapse into costume within an opera or music will always collapse into being the musical grounds, the musical aura of a show. Their strategies are so different that they can't be combined without this sense of losing something integral to one of them. So what would an art form that allowed two things to coexist, or any of the disciplines to exist in and of themselves on their own terms be? Again, this comes on, we can relate this back to the first thing I was saying, in that at a purely generic level, someone would come to a fashion opera and say this is a fashion show, and somebody else would say this is an opera, and it has to be like that. If you're saying, oh, this is definitely one thing or the other, or a dance performance for that matter. If you're saying, oh, this is a composite, something is delegated to something else to combine into something between, without that tension that the contradictory aspects of these disciplines imply, it would be lost. It would be not working. So I can't speak about how that works between disciplines, but as you said, I'm also a writer. In creating the operas, I'm trying to be very, very aware of that contingency. And what that means at a technical level for things like word setting and libretto writing is that
you write your own librettos?
Yes. So what that means is that you are freed from the drudgery of contemporary libretto writing, where you have to work to the ideas of music, and similarly that music has to work to the ideas of literature, and rather actually the expressive potential of both is unleashed. It's why the libretti are. They are, just to give some characteristics, incredibly dense, lyrical, not concerned with the physical limitations of opera, such as the fact that it has to be sung, that it has to be received, that it has to be understood. Similarly, with vocal writing, does not have to work within the confines of things like word setting or with tessitura of the voice, and rather unleashes both to be very expressive. I think once you get past this idea that there are certain things in the opera world that are taken as givens, like this has to be understood in a certain way, this has to be done in a certain way, that are for all however radical a contemporary opera can be, doesn't go beyond those limits. And again, to find that by unleashing, for instance, these two practices to work according to their own strategies, so they're still bound by things like poetic form or musical form. I think you get a contingent relation between them that is more than what would happen if they delegated to the meanness of what one another opposes on them. And the same thing happens with collaboration with other aspects like fashion and dance. Any choreographer or fashion designer you work with, it is total freedom. It is not, you're not making a costume that has to support the work. You are making the central point of the work. You are making the only thing that matters, if that makes sense. Whether you are the composer or the writer or the designer or the dancer, and again, just to relate this to what we were talking before, or indeed the performer. The performer is able to say, I want to change this completely. I'm cutting this, I'm playing this in a different way. I won't do that. Each person is the center point, if that makes sense. Each is and though that's obviously that can't happen, but it does. Similarly, as two people have see the work in a totally different being within the work. So the practice of creating the work has a different being depending on the perspective of the participant.
All right. So I just have a remark. When you say fashion, if one would say this is only fashion will always collapse itself. Is this why all the costumes, at least what I've seen up until now, are inflatable? So it's like they would actually collapse. Sorry, really, really horrible remark.
We would really like to work with proper inflatables. I know Gemma, who has directed many of the operas and curated the fest, very keen to work with inflatables. So I will.
Right.
It's a very prescient remark. Hopefully in the future, yes.
Yeah, because it's also a very specific dress. I would say dress code. It's probably not correct to say the customography. Very, very specific, and whoever sees this can take a look at the existing recordings of it on the internet. Now, further from that, the writing. What about, again, back to the speaker of the dead? How did that materialize for that composition? Perhaps. Again, you can speak to that as a reference for anyone that goes in and hears that composition recorded, and also to the facts of being also a writer.
And it's great to be able to talk about that. I was really enjoyed working with you guys on that. I thought your performance was absolutely amazing. So thank you so much. And
thank you.
It was it's really, because it was a total experiment. So speaker for the composition 1 began when I was working with you in Maribor, and I was doing some research into ancient Paleolithic art, and had encountered the cave of Chauvet through some of the writings of Alain Badiou, but also had the book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, the new approaches to the study of archaeology, and I was hit. It's, you know what it's like when you are now and again you just get hit by this something that you haven't experienced before, and for me it was, I suppose, like the first time hearing opera, that the presence of just how much human art has been lost, and how, how, when I was also watching, watching this film by who is it? The guy made Fitzcarraldo. Werner Herzog has made a wonderful documentary about the Cave of Chauvet, where you can see the artworks pretty well, and they're just so absolutely remarkable. And to think how much human endeavor, how many ring cycles, how many how many Hamlets, how many wonderful works of art have just been lost to time, and particularly in the sense of music. Music is such an ephemeral. It's not something that we can inscribe on the walls like in Chauvet. It's not like it's something that is totally lost. And it was this very, I suppose, I can't say it anywhere else. It sounds really silly, but it was like a deep sense of grief. That and wonder, almost in the same way that you sometimes get from staring up into the stars and dreaming of the future and dreaming about what human beings going to other planets. It was like that, but back in time, seeing that actually, because we only ever think of human history as going back to, well, we say I only ever thought of it as going back, into the fairly recent past, back to things like the Trojan War and the Egyptian.
What if it's not forever lost? What if isn't it so that the inscription of the genome always changes according to what someone does in their lifetime? So isn't it also in a sense, no matter if we can or cannot hear it and see it and experience it, as we can experience I can experience a painting that is in the room. What if it's still a part of us? And
absolutely, and I totally agree. And that was the idea behind Speaker for the Dead. Sorry, behind Composition One. But and I agree with you entirely. Like, that's what it's trying to get at. However, I was lucky to be looking at. I was in Paris the other day, looking at some paintings, and it is your memory of the painting, even the one that you've seen before, will never compare to actually being in front of it. The thing that the object does to you. There are even there was. I got this book the other day that has fragments from the rest of the epic cycle that we've lost, apart from the Iliad and the Odyssey. There was like many other books written within it, or that we have only tiny little fragments of, and it's an amazing thing to read that fragment and to read, other things and imagine it. But it'll never be like that feeling that you have of the bit when, when Odysseus comes in, when he first comes home and he's talking to that farmer, is it the pig farmer? Yeah, the swineherd, and it's so, it's incomparable, to actually you're interfacing with an aesthetic object. So on one hand, I totally agree with you. That's what we have, right? That we have a ability to get back to it, but through its ontology rather than its phenomenology, which means through what it is rather than reconstructing its limits.
Right.
So Composition One is, I suppose, it's firstly a kind of theoretical critique of historically informed practice in archaeoacoustic study, which outlines the various reasons that we can't. The central argument is that we can't recreate the artistic exception by imposing a physical material limit, and that's what a lot of archaeoacoustics does. It says this is what was available to hand, so what can we create within that? But an artwork, or a great artwork, is always something that surpasses those limits, something that is truly exceptional, that nobody could have believed possible. Whether you look at, Manet's cathedrals, or, we were talking about the Ring earlier. That's one of the examples that even if we were trying to, say, in the future, reconstruct the Ring from its contemporaries, its excesses would be unthinkable, and it would be lost. So you have to think not about the limit, but the surpassing of it. That's what Chauvet does. You know, if you look at the panel of the rhinoceroses, there's a rhinoceros quivering. You see its outline quivers in the paint, almost like the futurists painted the dog, or you know, that wasn't. That stretches back from our own time all the way to Chauvet. So that, as you say, the idea is that you get on something that is what Alan Badu calls an eternal truth, an invariant truth that we do have access to, and to move from that truth backwards, which was the attempt of composition one. So where does you asked about where the writing comes in on that? One of the procedures of this type of what speculative archaeoacoustics, which is a bit of a mouthful. Was it? Sorry, I've got to. Is that in moving backwards, we have to impose structures without imposing limits. So again, it comes back to some of the things we were talking about before. To allow for the aesthetic to happen, for plurality to actually happen, you have to create a structure, right? Otherwise, you've got a mess of clothes rather than the wardrobe of many different outfits, right? Yeah. How do you create the wardrobe? How do you create the structure without creating a limit? Which is like, we can only have these clothes within the wardrobe now, I suppose, to extend the metaphor. And the idea behind that was through satire, and I mean that in the old sense of the term, because satire is something that always, in constructing a limit, attempts to move you beyond the confines of your own. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like, if we think of the tradition, let's say Star Trek is a really good example of great satire. It presents to you a situation from your own world, but with guys wearing, rubber masks, and they look. So, for instance, the Ferengi are a great satire on late capitalism. They look horrible and they're greedy and they have this terrible society. So you hate them, but their world is essentially, their planet adapts to what the world, our world today does.
Right.
That old idea from Jonathan Swift, right? In Gulliver's Travels, when the people are small, they seem ridiculous. When they're large, they seem terrifying, but they're just. So both of these are examples of limits, that you've constructed a world, but by doing that, we've seen our own differently. So you have to think in this kind of the way of my proposal for that is constructing some kind of science theory fiction. I mean, the other model would be people like the CCRU, Reza Negrestani, this kind of mix between philosophy and literature, where the two disciplines can take on one another's strategies to do something that neither can. So, so to create some kind of satirical science theory fiction, of course that can't be the only thing. That would be the basis of the work. I think what you're alluding to is the presence of a novel. So the work functions by the truth. The truth I was trying to get back to obviously involves the other work, builds on my other work about plurality, right? So it was this idea of the idea of the possibility of what I've called a contingent dialectic, that we were talking about earlier. This was the truth I wanted to get back to, and the science theory fiction aspect of it was the proposal that this would have happened at some point in the past, the movement of music from the domain of the group to the domain of the individual. So the domain, or the idea of the domain of the hymn to the domain of the relic, might be another way of saying it. The idea of music as a practice, which is created by people together doing things, to an individual, to somebody imagining something. And that, I think it's pretty, I think that's a pretty safe thing to propose, even just from a satirical science fiction perspective, right? That pretty much that functions as a pretty good instance of the appearing of that sense of impossible contradiction between the individual and the group. You might even say that's an eternal truth, right? And one of the ways that was realized technically was the superimposition. using the human mind as a score. So the human mind's ability to hold two things within it simultaneously. And so the score, obviously, this is in a pre-writing world. So how would you construct something symbolic? Through this ability within the human mind, that you can attempt to play something that is not that is there within your own psychic interior. And there are many steps to it. As you know, later it involves the ensemble combining these experiences together. But the main experience is in the reading of the novel, which takes the form of whatever structural, symbolic world this composer would live in, and combines it against the physical landscape that they live in as well. Sorry, I don't know if I'm explaining that particularly well, but basically the instruction for the score was that the musicians had to move through a landscape whilst reading a novel. And combine those two things within their minds, and then that became the score that had to be played, the combination of those things. The novel the content of it wasn't so important as the structure. Again, it had to be something that was a limited structure, a full thing that would allow for plurality in its combination with the landscape. And to me, it felt like it had to be that. My regret is that the novel wasn't finished for the piece, and so you only got a kind of work in progress for it. But that is actually finished now. Fully. Yeah. So perhaps in the future, if we do it again, we'll see if it changes at all. But as I say, it's not the content that is so important as the nature of the stuff.
It's read like I was thinking to myself how to describe this the perplexity or where to trace the perplexity that this novel amused me with, and I figured I could say it's read like a dream, very, in a sense, a constant flow of things that don't make sense to a living human being, not living, to a awake human being, quote unquote, don't make sense, and also with. With a lack of any restraints that we live with, so we can, coexist respectfully, and are in this context, I thought fantastic and humorous and original.
Thank you. Maybe you could tell it. Because as I say, I feel. Your performance of that work was so amazing, and I keep going around to it and going, you've written a really good piece, and I keep going around and saying, I really didn't write it. And you think you're just being modest, and you're like, no, I really had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
You guys...
You always say that.
But in this case, it's true,
You also said that for 7 maps.
Oh, yeah. So... but maybe you could say about like your process of arranging this work by this long dead composer, because I would be interested to hear that.
Well, the first thing I remember in regards to preparing this composition for its performance is how, especially with you being they're like this, you do it, it's yours to interpret, it's yours to perform, it just put us in positions where we had to re-evaluate some of the premises of, first of all, just how we're reading the text, specifically the instruction text. We didn't go into trying to unify anything, because in terms of the fiction content, so this was immediately accepted, if I remember correctly, as a given. So everyone has their own, everyone reads it as them, as an individual. But it did put us in position where, in a lot of positions where we have no clue what to do. So we had to take a step back and actually, say, wait a minute, okay, what we can do here is this. What we can do here is this. On the sound level, how is this? Are we doing something completely stupid right now by, are we doing something that is self-evident just because? A lot of those. I thought that was the most significant part, plus the fact that as an ensemble, we had to accept that we will really have to listen to each other. And that, which is, you always listen to each other, but I guess this kind of, and many compositions of chamber nature, when you take a close look,
if you're doing something stupid, that's usually when you're onto something great. If you're like, oh my god, this is so stupid, you're like, that's even though it feels terrible, you're like, yes, gold dust.
Of course, and this happened. It happened. We were also like, someone was like, "This is stupid," and the other was like, "So what?" So, it's not at verbatim, but as I remembered and as I saw it, this is also what happened. So yeah, I think many chamber pieces demand different way of listening to each other, and here perhaps we had to build one specific under group of a skill set of listening to each other for this piece.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so with this, let's move on to also what you are currently working on, still hot in the oven. You were already mentioning at the beginning the negativity field of vision works. Oh, yeah. Also, a birdie told me about this work called the Major Arcana, and that is being performed this Saturday. So can we go now to this part and tell us what's happening right now?
Yeah, so the Major Arcana is a large work for Brina Kran that I'm creating over the next year, which is just something I've always had an interest in since I was a kid, was the tarot. I'm a total materialist. I'm almost to the point of being your card carrying vulgar materialist, despite through years of playing with the tarot, I've learned to respect it hugely, in that it is for whatever reason, whether it's a joke, which is the nature of the universe that has a sense of humor, but the tarot can really has an uncanny sense of predicting things. I think the reason that's probably the case is because of the way that we function as symbolic creatures, right? So we read a novel, even if it was from 8,000 years ago, and you're like, wow, this happened to me yesterday, and it can help right?
Yeah.
Achilles is in the huff, and he gets, you can, and you're like, oh, I'm also in the huff, and you work out how you can get through that. And that's something a bit like getting, one of the swords cards down. You're like, oh my god. But that would be one way of interpreting it. On the other hand, as soon as you think that, sometimes you'll do a line of tarot cards and you will think, wow. So I learned two things from it. One is to just respect the, one is, I suppose, that idea of how great meaning can arise from pure contingency. I'm just putting some cards down on the table. On the other hand is a respect for the unknowable nature of reality, to the point that it sometimes seems to almost have a sense of humor. And I always wanted to create a work based on this, and that's what this for Brina is that there's this. I'm going to do just lots and lots of work based on each one of the cards of the Major Arcana. Each will be a single piece of A4. And the idea is that hopefully at the end, you will be able to deal them like a pack of cards and do any spread that you want. At which point you, as the reader, will have to reinterpret the pieces in that way. So in the same way that if you put down, let's take a card, let's take something like the Fool, which can mean, say, innocence or new beginnings or stupidity, depending on where it lands up in the spread, and also how you are reading it. In the same way that a word can mean many different things. So the meaning of the card will change absolutely depending on your context and depending on the other cards. And my hope is that when all the pieces are finished, the musician will be able to intervene and, as I said before, really desecrate the works. So that if, for instance, the Fool, for instance, which I think is what Brina's playing this Saturday, is one. Firstly, you could keep the notes the same, and obviously just in the way that we always interpret music, interpret the sense that the piece has there's a sense basically of somebody on the edge of a cliff over the void, and you could play that as many different things. You could also intervene and change the notes, change the dynamics. You could even change the piece altogether and play something totally different, depending on, which can happen with the cards. The cards can change their meaning almost totally, depending on how the spread works. So again, it's some of the things we've talked about already, about this idea of transformation and contingency and meaning arising from that. So it's been very exciting collaborating with Brina on that, and I'm very excited to hear. This Saturday I heard a recording the other day and it's sounding absolutely brilliant. The other thing was what I'm doing right now is I suppose I'm groping around in the darkness. It would be a good way to describe it if we finish where we began. In that, and the other day, I told you the other day I was in Paris looking at some things, and I had this idea when I was looking at, actually it was Michelangelo's Dying Slave, which was that there is something, and we may listen back to this in a month and I'll be like, wow, that is the most banal insight. Which, I'll be very embarrassed. Maybe we just cut it off there now, because I'm still trying to work through the. But it was the sense of there being something. It was the sense of there being this very physical, objective experience of the oblong, right? Which is to do with the relationship between the way the sculpture works, right? Between the limits of the human body and the way that there's some power within it that seems to writhe against it, which also relates to the idea of the marble, the material itself, etc., etc., etc. All of that's totally banal. The idea was that you could see something that wasn't there, that I think everybody sees, that is actually part of the artwork in a very physical sense, something that's not there, that arises from the material technical decisions by the artist, that is there as much as the marble is, and which you see. It's not an affect, it's not an emotion that's created within you, it's a thing. It's almost like something that's behind you that you're looking at, but you're still looking at it, if that makes sense. And another example of it might be I'm sorry, this is going to sound very garbled, because as I say, I'm really groping around in the darkness here. It's just the beginning of it. But another example would be John Foss's Septology, which is this. I don't know if you've read it before. It's a book about. It's all told in basically one sentence, one breath, and it mirrors the patterns of speaking and also invocation and prayer, and through things like these very understandable technical choices by the artist, something arises from the book that is not, again, it's not an emotion, it's not the vision of the thing happening, but it's more like a sense of atmosphere, or even, without sounding too ridiculous here, the only way I can describe it is like a modality of affect, a kind of the atmosphere in the water in which something appears. And it's not in the book. It's not anywhere in the book. It's not even in the techniques themselves, but is and it's not in the things that it describes, but it's as much a part of the artwork as this oblong thing in the Dying Slave. I think a third example would be, I'm just rereading In Search of Lost Time. The first translation I read was the recent Penguin translation, in which you got the thing that is, well, I didn't quite realise it, but you got the thing that is Proust. This, again, like the thing in the John Foss book, it's a material thing. It's not in the words. It's not in the things they describe. It's in your remembrance of the book. It's not in the emotions. It's something else, but it's there. And in rereading the updated Edwardian translation, it was just not there at all. So you can, again, it will be through choices in the words on a very small level that add up to produce something much greater. So I haven't done the study yet, but reading the more recent Oxford World Classics translation, it's there again, this thing, like the oblong slave, like the sensation of something behind you in the John Foss book, it's there. And so these are three kind of scattergun explanations. It's different. It seems to me that there is something within the idea that there is something that is objective, conjured by the subject. Not in the sense of the phenomenal experience of it, not in the sense of the emotions that it provoked, but in something that is actually almost like a slingshot back into the artwork that then produces all of those things. And I'm very interested in exploring what that is. To me, it seems to be another example of this idea of a material relation. This thing that connects, that between myself between the subject and the object, something very profound is created. It's not profound, but something material is created that is not just a composite of the two things that we are, that it's not just a meeting, but a true material relation that links us to the world in a very certain way and proves that, ultimately, even in the absence of anything like God, we're never alone. It's not that we're trapped within our own minds in some kind of subjectivity, but rather our subjectivity is a link to the world that surpasses any idea of the Kantian literal zone or anything like that. That rather there is this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, like a kind of, it's the opposite of what happens in an impressionist painting. Say in an impressionist painting, you can objectivize the subject, right? You can you take what you can see, and you can put your impression on the painting. And of course, what that really is a permission for free play and with the paint, and for the most dazzling virtuosic displays of things that you don't really see at all, right? But it's almost like the end of a prohibition. This is the opposite of that, in which the artwork creates something within itself that is not physically there, but is as real as the paper and the marble in which it's written on, and yet is not something provoked within you in the same way as an emotion. So I don't know. So I'm trying to build on this idea within the Fields of Vision series. This is the only stage I'm at the moment. And as I say, I apologize. It may turn out to be the most awful of observations, but it's also the most exciting part of, I'm sure you know this also, the most exciting part of being an artist is when you get to see something that you feel you've never seen before. And it's very, very exciting for a while as you try to work out what it is. And you're usually wrong, perhaps, about everything, but it will hopefully turn up something of interest.
And there's no word for it yet, so I'm looking forward to perhaps at some time in the future hearing about it and reading about it.
Thank you. Or somebody watching this interview would be like, yeah, but that's so obvious. That's, it's probably like the first page of my first book of aesthetics or something like that. It's probably called something really stupid.
They can write it in the comment on YouTube. So, okay, we will inform you if there is one word comment somewhere. And at this point, also, I would.
Yes, we can get people watching. Yeah, what do you think? Am I talking rubbish? Comment below.
Exactly, and they will have your contact there, or no phone number. Don't worry, just the web page. So at this point, since we are at the conclusion of this conversation, I would ask you, as I ask everyone that's here, for 2 brief messages. One of them for anyone that is considering of beginning with composition, and another one for anyone that will go and listen to your works after this.
Oh, that's a really great question. If you're thinking about beginning in composition, do it. It's the most rewarding and beautiful and incredible of art forms, because we still don't know. It's like consciousness. We still have no idea what it really is. We have no idea what we're doing, and that's makes it so beautiful. All we can do is kind of construct realities in which there's some kind of meaning, but they're always just constructions. It's really a world that you can make and remake,
right?
As you will. It's also because of its social position, in that it's really fallen down. So composition is the least respected of all the arts, right? We're like we've gone back to being the jester in the medieval court, wearing the no clothes, shaking the rattle and everything. So, it's not like you're not bound by the same conventions as the contemporary, as the novelist or even the artist. It exists somewhere outside of any meaningful conception of modernity, and so you have a great freedom. It's a beautiful thing to do. So yeah, I would suggest a really great book to start with is the Reginald Smith book on atonal composition. I'll try and send it to Nežo and put it in the comments. A great, really, really great book to start with, because it gives you a complete system of doing something quite quickly. Even if you're not interested in atonal music, it's something that's quite easy to get your head around. And anybody listening to my music, thank you. God, please, anything to get me up off the 3 listeners on Spotify at the moment. I checked this the other day. 3. I'll be eternally grateful, even if you just put it on in the background silently. No, I would be I would be incredibly grateful. I very much hope you enjoy it. Why don't you? So thank you.
Great. Thank you for your messages, Alastair, and thank you for sharing the insights on your compositional practice.
Thanks so much for a great chat, Nežo. It's been wonderful seeing you today. Hope to catch you.
Likewise.